Hi everyone, my name's Sam Snodgrass and I'm going to be talking to you about the work I've been doing with Santiago and Tunyon on leveraging multilayer representations for procedural level generation. Now, as most of you probably know, procedural content generation is the algorithmic creation of content such as stories, quests, in-game objects, but most commonly levels and maps. And there have been a lot of different approaches to generating content, such as using evolutionary or search-based algorithms, grammars, or fractals, just to name a few. But recently there's been increased interest in PCG via machine learning, or approaches which train a model on an existing corpus of content and then sample from that trained model in order to generate new content. But we noticed that most of these machine learning based approaches only focus on the structural information within a level, when obviously there's much more to a level than just the placement of the objects. So we began to wonder if incorporating some of this non-structural information can improve the trained models and the generated content. And specifically, we began investigating whether we can create a general way of capturing the different aspects of a level domain. And the way we propose to do this is by using multiple layers of representation in order to deeply represent the levels, where each layer is meant to capture a distinct aspect of the level domain. Obviously, there'd still be a structural layer which captures object placement and things like that, but you could potentially also include paths through the level or a difficulty curve or other type of meta information like that. And then what we want to do is train a model that's able to capture these different aspects as well as the relations across the layers, and then sample new levels from that trained model. So in our work, in our initial investigation, we used 3 layers. We used the standard structural layer, which many of you are probably familiar with, and this just models the object and enemy placements, things like that. But then we also included a player path layer, which models a player or agent's path through a level, as well as a height or section layer, which splits the level into different sections for more focused training. So then once we have these layers defined, we need a model that's able to learn from them. So in our work, we use a multidimensional Markov chain, or an MDMC. So with our single layer MDMC approach, we use the network structure in the blue box. And what this network structure says is that a given position, or a value at a given position, is dependent upon the values at the surrounding positions within the structural layer. And in our single layer approach, all we had was a structural layer. But to extend this to use the multi-layer data, we need to add additional nodes representing positions in the other layers. So then once we have this updated network structure, we estimate the probabilities of transitioning from a given object or structure or tile type to another one by the observed occurrences within the training data. So now in order to sample a new level, we first need to define the non-structural layers for that level. In our work, we've manually defined these layers, but they can also be defined by sampling them beforehand or automatically defining them in some way. And once we have these other layers defined, we sample the structural layer tile by tile by probabilistically choosing the next tile based on the surrounding tiles, the tiles in the other layers, and the trained probability distribution. But we also want to make sure that the levels that we sample are actually usable and playable. So to do this, we use a constrained sampling approach, which is able to enforce a playability constraint on the generated levels. And the way it does this is by first allowing the model to sample an entire new level, then checking this constraint on that level and resampling any portions of the generated level that hinder the playability. So in order to evaluate this this approach, we experimented with two domains, Super Mario Bros. And Loadrunner. Now, both these domains are platforming games, but they require very different play styles in order to complete them. For example, Super Mario Bros. Requires pretty much linear paths through the level. You just need to make it from the left of the level to the right of the level. Whereas in Loadrunner, which is more of a puzzle type platforming game, you need to travel around the whole map, avoiding enemies, and collecting all these different treasures. So this results in much more complex paths through the level. During our experiments, we used two different setups for the domains. For Mario, we experimented with four different paths, two human paths extracted from YouTube videos, and two manually created paths, a simple plateau-shaped path and a more complex path that required a lot of different jumps of various heights and lengths. And then for Loadrunner, we used 10 human paths extracted from YouTube videos. And then we compared the levels generated using our multi-layer approach against those generated using our single-layer approach. In order to evaluate and compare the generated levels, for Mario, we used the Frazier Distance, which is basically a measure of path similarity, and we use this to compare the actual path through a level against the desired path provided in the path layer. And we also investigated whether objects in the game were placed meaningfully, and I'll get more into that once we get to the results. And then for Loadrunner, we looked at the number of sections that needed to be resampled for both the single and the multi-layer approach to see if using the multi-layer approach added a lot of complexity to the model. And we investigated the percentage of treasures placed on the desired path as an approximation of path similarity. So first we're going to go through our Mario results, and here you can see example levels sampled using each of the different paths as well as the single layer approach. Specifically, I want you to take a look at multi P3, the second from the bottom, and towards the end here you can see all the structures kind of line up to allow for a plateau style path through the level there, where you have to jump up and then run across and go down. And then in multi P4, you'll notice that there's structures and gaps scattered through the level, and this is to force jumps of various sizes and lengths. So this is promising, but we need to do more than just visual investigation, and so we look at the Frazier distance. And we kind of use the single layer approach as a baseline here, since the single layer approach doesn't have any path information built into it. But we can see that with the multi-layer approach, we're able to get paths, we're able to generate levels that require paths that are fairly similar, at least when compared to the single layer approach, to the desired paths. And this is most notable with path 4, where in the single layer approach, it has a very difficult time approximating that path, but in the multi-layer approach, we're able to capture it very easily. And at the bottom here, you can see an example where red is the actual path, blue is the desired path, and purple is the overlap. And this is a level that had a low Frazier distance. So next, we wanted to investigate the meaningful placement of game objects. And in Mario, we did this by looking at springs. Now, springs in Mario allow for higher and longer jumps than are normally possible. And we wanted to see if by incorporating additional non-structural information, we can place these springs in more meaningful positions. Now, in the training data, about a quarter of the springs placed are required in order to complete the level. In the single layer approach, we only place about 1% of the springs in meaningful positions, but with our multi-layer approach, we generally place around 5% in places that are important. And at the bottom here you can see on the left a spring that isn't needed to complete the level, and on the right a spring that is needed to complete the level. So this is promising because it shows that by incorporating additional information, we can kind of capture these more intricate details of a domain. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Loadrunner results. So here's just two examples, one level sampled with the multi-layer approach and the path, a potential path annotated, and with the single layer approach with an annotated path. Now, what we want to look at for the Loadrunner results is how much complexity did using the multi-layer representation add to the models? How difficult did it make it to actually generate new levels? And as you can see from this, on average, they need to resample about the same number of sections to generate a usable level. Obviously, there's some outliers here. Multi-P5 and multi-P8 both require a lot more than the average in order to generate usable levels. And this could be that those two paths just happen to be more difficult to allow than the other ones. So that might influence the complexity of the model. But in general, we see that they take about the same amount of resamples. So the next thing we wanted to look at is how well do we actually approximate the path that we provide. And we do this by, or we measure this by seeing how many of the treasures that we place on the level are placed on the desired path. So this means that the player is going to have to pass through these positions in order to complete the level. And you can see using the single layer as a baseline, since it doesn't have any path information, the multi-layer is able to, in some cases, place 100% of the treasures on the desired path, and in general, around 90% of the treasures are placed in positions that would require the player to pass through them on the desired path, which is great because it shows that this model is able to roughly approximate the paths that are provided to it, even though those paths are much more complex than the Mario paths may be. So what did we learn? Well, we saw that we were able to create a general representation that is able to capture more than just structural information, which is great. So we use this in a tile-based approach with our MDMC model, but the multi-layer representation can be used with really any type of representation as long as you're able to split them into distinct aspects, and with any model that can take those representations. We saw that our multi-layer approach are able to create levels that allow for the specific player paths that are provided, and that they're able to more accurately capture domain intricacies, such as spring placement, which is very promising. So what are we working on next? So we want to not have to define our layers manually. We'd like to be able to either sample these layers prior to sampling the structural layer or at the same time, or define them in some automatic way. And we also want to explore additional layers that capture maybe more meta information, such as difficulty curves or aesthetic information, things like that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.